Hey, and welcome back to another video, and in this video we'll be looking at how we can cache images with NSCache, which helps us improve the performance of our apps when working with data in a list. So just to show you the problem that we'll be tackling here, if we actually look at our screen here, this is an example from my previous video, Async image in SwiftUI, which you can check out. And we actually have a list of async images in here, which is only available in iOS 15. If you actually look at it, you might be thinking that the app that we have here is not actually re-downloading any of the images. But if we actually go to the inspector tab here to actually look at what's going on, and if we actually just click on network, you'll see that as I start scrolling, we're actually re-downloading images, because you can see these spikes of where we're actually making network requests to get data. So as you can see, our app is actually making unnecessary requests all the time that an image comes onto the screen. So what's actually going on here? Well, at the time of this recording, things may change because WWDC is coming up pretty soon on the 6th of June. Async image doesn't actually really support caching options. So every time an image goes off the screen and comes back onto the screen, the service is actually re-downloading it. And this is why, in my opinion, if you have a collection of loads of data where you have images, you probably want to avoid using async image, because it'll be quite heavy on your apps if you have a load of images. You know, think about an app like Instagram where there's like high quality images. This can heavily affect the performance of your app. So how can we fix this? Well, what we can actually do is actually build our own async image using the new Swift concurrency framework available to us. And if you want to learn more about Swift concurrency, then you should check out my video, Getting Started with Swift Concurrency, which is a free course on my channel. So the first thing we need to do is actually build our object that we will use to execute a network request, since we're going to be requesting some data that we're going to set in some kind of image view. So in order to do this, we're going to use a struct, and we actually don't need a class for our networking class, since we don't need to keep a reference of it. It'll only handle giving us back data from a service. It's also worth noting that you can actually download this starter project already from my GitHub as well. So let's create a new folder in here called cache. And then within this folder, we're going to create a new file called image retriever. And then within this file, I'm just going to type out the base implementation of what it's going to do. Okay, cool. So now we have our struct image retriever, and what this is going to do is we're going to pass in some kind of image URL, which is a string, and it's going to be an async function because it can asynchronously get data, and it's going to also throw because something could go wrong. And when it finishes successfully, it will return to us some data. Now, right now, I'm just returning some empty data because we've not actually wrote the implementation for executing our network request. So now what we want to do is we now want to actually write the code to execute our network request and return the data from the result. So I'll type this out again and then we'll break it down. So now what we're using here is a guard where we unwrap the URL, and if this is successful, then we're going to use the new async await syntax in URL session to execute a network request, and we're going to try await. So try means that this could throw an error. That's why we're using try. And we're going to await the result that we get back from the service. And we're going to access the data and return the data. Now, right now in our guide, we actually do have an error because we're not actually handling the errors that are thrown here. So the reason why we want to handle the errors here is because it's actually possible for a URL to be invalid. So in here, we don't want to actually just return, we actually want to throw some kind of error. So on our image retriever, let's actually create an error for an invalid URL. So let's do that now. So now we've created a private extension on our image retriever. We have an enum that is of type error, and we're going to set the case to be invalid URL. So in here, rather than us returning, we actually want to throw that error. So let's do that now. Cool. So now we're handling all the cases of where things could go wrong, and it's really important that you do this, because if you don't handle the cases properly, it's actually possible that your app is just stuck in limbo. Sweet. So now that we have our object for fetching data, we actually now need to handle caching data as well. So how can we do this? Well, there's actually something available to us in iOS called an NSCache. And what this allows us to do is actually add items into our app's memory whilst it's alive. So we can actually retrieve data and objects from there. Now, it's worth noting that this cache isn't unlimited. And in fact, if you exceed the cache limit by adding a new item, it will actually remove items from the cache for you. The best way to think about a cache is it's like a shopping bag. You can put items in there that you want for later, but if you can't fit anything more, then what's going to happen is you're going to have to remove something so you can add that item into the bag. So this is actually going to help us with managing our memory, because you don't want your app to be using the entire memory available so that other applications and services on your phone can't function. So actually look into creating a new file now called image cache within our cached folder. So we just go in here, I'm just going to create a new file called image cache. Cool. So now I'm just going to type out the skeleton for this. So now for our image cache this time, I've actually used a class and not a struct. And the reason why I'm using a class and not a struct here is because we're actually going to create something called a singleton for our cache. And the reason why we're using a singleton is because we want our image cache to only have one instance of itself. And if you remember before with SwiftUI, my video breaking down SwiftUI, our views are re-invalidated every single time the state changes. So if we just had this as a class, or if we just had this as a struct, it's actually possible that whenever our views get re-rendered, our image cache will get reset. So by us having this as a singleton, we only have one instance that we keep alive for the entire existence of our app whilst it's in memory. So what I'm going to do now is just do a bit of typing and then we'll break it down. So what we're doing here is the base blueprint for our singleton. So now that we've done this, we're actually able to type out something like image cache dot shared. And now we're able to access all the properties within our singleton. Now it's really important that when you create a singleton that you use the private init so that someone can't create an instance of this class. They can only access it via the static shared constant where you're able to access an instance of your image cache. So now let's actually create this within this file. So I've got a type alias here called cache type, and it is of type NSCache. And within the NSCache, when you're using it, you have to actually use its generic, which here is the key and the object. So this is the key for the item in your cache, and this is the actual object that's going to be saved. Now, when you're working with this, you need to use the NS class that is available. So it needs to be of type NS. So NS is anything that is of type NS object. So in this case, you can't just use string and data. You need to use NS string or NS data. And if it was an integer, it would have to be an NS number or whatever the equivalent of that is in Cocoa. So we're using a string here because we want to use the URL from the image as its key. And we're using a data here because we want to save the data associated with that image. And the reason why I created a type alias here is so it's just a lot easier for us to read. Now, if we scroll down, you'll see here that we actually have our private lazy var cache, which is of type cache type. This is us creating an NS cache, which has a key of NS string and an object of NS data. And when we create it, we're going to set the count limit to 100, meaning that you can have 100 items within it. And we're also going to set the total cost limit as well, which of here is 50 megabytes. So this calculates to this many bytes, which when converted equals 50 megabytes, and then return it. So now you may be wondering why the lazy keyword. So the reason why I've marked this as lazy is because this will actually not be initialized until we actually directly use this cache here. So now within our singleton, we actually need to create the functions for actually saving and retrieving our objects from the cache. So now we have these two functions. So the first function that we have on our cache is object for key. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to actually grab a object from the cache, and we have to pass in the key for that object. Now the type here that we're going to be returning is an optional data because it's possible that there may or may not be data for that object in the cache. And then for the key, we're going to be passing in NS string to access that item. Now this is to get an item. In order to save an item, we need to use the set object function, and as you can see in our function here, we've got our object that we're going to pass in and our key. So this is saving the object and the key for that object as well. So these two functions that we've got in our image cache are essentially just wrappers around them. And I've just realized this, but we actually don't need this return here as well, because Swift can automatically pick it up. So let's just remove that return function. Cool. So now we've got our wrapper functions. Okay, cool. So now we have our file for retrieving our image from the service and now actually getting an image from the cache. Rather than us tackling both at the same time, we're actually going to first of all just look at how we can handle getting an image from a service. So first of all, let's see how we can tackle that in our new view that we'll create called cached image view, and then we'll tackle the caching afterwards. So in order to do this, we're actually going to need an observable object. So let's actually create this in a new file called cached image manager. And if you want to learn more about observable objects, then check out my video observable object and published in SwiftUI. So if you just create a new Swift file, and if we just call this now within this new Swift file, I'm just going to do some typing and we'll break it down. So now we have a final class here called Cache Image Manager, and it's of type observable object, and we've got a published property so we can listen to changes that happen within this Cache Image Manager. Now the reason why I've marked this as private set is because I only want views to be able to listen to the changes from this property, and they don't actually have the ability to directly change them. So now we actually need to create a view to actually hold this source of truth. So now let's create our SwiftUI view called cached image. So we just hit file new, and then we create a new SwiftUI view called cached image. And then within this cached image, we're going to create an instance of our cached image manager. Cool. So now we have an instance of our cached image manager, and we've marked it with the state object because this is the source of truth for this view, and private, so it's only within the scope of this view as well. So now we actually need to create a property to allow someone to actually pass in some kind of URL into this cached image view. So just below your state object, if you just type out let URL, so now what this will allow us to do is pass a URL in. Now you might be wondering, why did I use string and not the URL directly? Well, the reason being is because in our image retriever class, we're actually going to handle any kind of errors with the URL. So this will actually throw errors for us. So we're going to do that in the business logic and not directly in the view. So we should get an error in our SwiftUI preview because we now need to set this argument. And in this string here, I'm just going to copy a URL from our view model. Just copy this one here. And then I'm just going to paste that here like so. Okay, cool, sweet. So now we need to actually create our function for getting our image in our manager and handle any errors within it. So I'm just going to go into our cached image manager, and I'm just going to type out this function and then we'll break it down. What we've done here is we've now created an instance of our image retriever. So this is the object that we're going to use to fetch an image from a service, and then we've now got our function here called load, where we pass in an image URL and it's async. But one thing you'll realize here is that we've added the main actor on top of it. Now the reason why we've added this property wrapper onto this function is because whenever you're working with data that interacts with the UI, you want to make sure that it actually makes those changes back onto the main thread. So without adding this main actor, you may actually get an error by Xcode telling you that you need to add it because you're making changes to the UI on the main thread from an async, from a background thread. So that's why we add this in. And then finally, what we do inside of here is we have a do catch where we try to await the retriever to get an image, and we set that to the data within this cache image manager. And then for any errors, we just print that out to the console. So now in our cache image view, we actually need to use this function. So let's actually add this in now and then set our image. So let's actually add this in, and then I'm going to break it down. So if we just go into our cached image, rather than having our text here, I'm just going to do a bit of typing. So what we've got here is we've just got a Z stack, And on the Z stack, you'll notice that we actually have this modifier here called task. So what is this? Well, what this task does is that as soon as the Z stack comes into the view, it will actually execute a asynchronous function from our manager. So this will actually execute a function to load an image from our URL. Now, what will happen as well is that if that image goes off the screen, this task will actually get cancelled for us as well. So when you're actually working with asynchronous functions with your views, like in the onAppear, you actually don't want to use onAppear here. You actually want to use task to execute those functions, and we need to await it because it's asynchronous. So within our Z stack, what we're saying here is that we want you to unwrap the manager data, and then we're going to unwrap it and create a UI image, and then we're going to set that UI image to an image view in SwiftUI. Now I've set it to Reusable and set a hard size of 100 by 100 and the content mode to be fit. So now we've not done any caching, we're just seeing if this works in terms of retrieving data. So let's actually just see if this works. So in order to actually see this in action, let's just go and use this in our file. So if you go into the food item view, you should notice that you have an async image here. Rather than having the async image and the if let URL, we're just going to comment all of this out, and we're going to replace it with cached image, and then we're just going to pass in our item dot image URL like so. So let's actually just run this and see what happens. Cool. So as you can see now, we've not got the same styles that we specified here before, which is fine. But you can see that we're actually getting our images back from the service and it's being set in our cached image view. But we've still got that issue where if I go to the inspector tab and I just start scrolling, you'll see now that we're getting lines here telling us that we're still fetching the image from the service, which is still an issue. So how can we get around this? Now look at incorporating our image cache. So if we just go into our cache image manager, what we want to do now is that on our load function, we actually want to inject our singleton. So what I'm going to do here is just add in another parameter and then we'll break it down. So what we're doing here is we're actually giving our cache image manager the ability to inject its own image cache. Now the reason why I just didn't use the singleton directly within the function is because in the future, if we want to, we're now able to actually pass in different types of image caches. So we may actually have an image cache that has its own logic and functionality, or we may have one that actually writes to the disk and actually saves it locally onto your machine. So this just gives us more flexibility in the future. So now what we want to do is before we actually execute this request to fetch the image, we actually want to check to see if that image actually already exists. Just above your do catch, we're going to do a bit of typing. So what we're doing here is we're just checking to see if we can get an object from the cache. It will set it inside of this constant here. And if it does get it from the cache with this URL, then we're going to set it within our data. We're going to print a message telling us that we're fetching the image. We'll just make this a bit more descriptive. Cache. And then we're going to stop execution with this return. So this will actually stop executing here. Now this is only half of it. What we actually need to do now is after we actually get our image back from the service here, we actually need to save it into the cache now as well. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to type this out and then we'll break it down. So after we get our image back from the service, what we're going to do now is we're actually going to try to cast it as NS data, and then we're going to store it in this constant called data to cache, and then we're going to save it within it using the image URL as its key. Now the reason why I'm casting it here like this is because if this fails, then we don't want to unnecessarily call this code to try to set the object in the cache. We only want to set it if it's successful. So now if we actually run this, let's see what happens. Okay, so we can now see in our logs that it's cached all these images and our network tab here. So I'm just going to start scrolling, and you'll now see that we're actually getting a message saying it's fetching the image from the cache, and we don't have any more network bars showing up. Now this solution is okay and it does work well if this is what you want for your solution, but one thing that I've realized is that right now on our food item view, if we go into our cached image, we're actually stuck with these styles. So we're not actually able to add in our own styles if we wanted to. So right now, all our images in our app will look like this. If you actually look at async image and the way it's been implemented, you're actually able to return an image back to the async image with the styles that you specified. Also, you can have a placeholder, and you can also handle errors as well. So that's something we're going to look into now. And in order to accomplish this, we're going to need to use a closure. And if you want to learn more about closures, then you should check out my video, Communicating Between Views in SwiftUI with Closures. So the first thing that we need to do is actually refactor our cache image manager and give it a new property to check the state of our view model. So let's do that now. So now within our cache image manager, we're going to have an enum called current state, which has three, which is loading, failed, and success. So if it's failed, we're going to pass through an error, which is thrown. And if it's successful, then we're going to pass through the data that we're going to use in our image. So now we need to update our publish property to actually hold this state rather than our data, since we want to change our views depending on what the current state is from our API request. So rather than it being data, let's update this to be current state. And then we're going to change this to be current state. So now we'll get quite a few errors because the type of data that we were using before has now changed. So now we need to update all of this. So the first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to add in a current state of loading whenever we call this function. So at the top here, outside of the optional chaining, we're just going to say self.currentState is equal to loading. So the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to set it to loading all the time. Then what we want to do here is that if we get an image outside the cache, we actually want to set the current state to be success and then pass through that image data. So let's change this to current state. And then let's change this to be success. And then we want this to be image data, like so. Cool. Within our do catch, what we want to do is we want to actually try to await the image fetch, but we actually want to store this inside of a constant because we want to use this value in more than one places. So let's just create a new property called data. And then we're going to write try await here, like so. And then within here, rather than having self.data, we're now going to say self.currentState is equal to the success, and that's going to be the data. And then now for our data, because this isn't an optional anymore, what we're now going to do instead is we're now going to just save this in our cache. So let's just move this out of the if let. And then now we'll just go print. Cool. And then we need to finally handle our last pause. So now let's just update this to be data because we want to store this within our cache. And then we're going to get an error saying we need to convert this to NS data, which is fine. So let's do that. Cool. So now in our catch statement, right now we're only printing the error, but instead of doing that, we actually want to set the current state to be failed and pass through that error. So let's do that now. Cool. So if we build this, it should be all good within this file. So now this is all good in this file, but now we actually need to look at our view file. And if we actually look at it, we actually have an error now because this data doesn't exist anymore. So in order to actually fix this, what we need to do is we actually want to kind of just replace all of this with a switch statement and just return empty views for now. And we'll tackle the next bit after I break this down. So what we're doing here is now is that depending on the current state, we're actually just going to be returning empty views. We'll replace this in a second, but based on what the state is, we're going to switch between different views and actually apply transitions like you can in async image. In our view, we actually wanted to allow users to pass in their own views for when it's loading, successful, or failed. So we need to use a closure to give someone the ability to pass this in their own view. But we also want to pass in a view depending on the state. So let's actually just write this out and then we'll break it down. So what we've done on our cache image now, we're using a generic where we're creating a generic for any view that is of type view. And we've also now got a new property here called content. Now this content is a closure. And if you want to learn more about closures, then check out my video, Communicating Between Views with Closures in SwiftUI. What we're saying here is we're going to pass through the current async image phase. So this is actually an enum that comes with SwiftUI. And what this will do is it will communicate to any view using this closure, whether it's a success, empty, or failure. And what we're saying here is we're going to return content. Now this content is just basically some kind of view. Now in order for actually to allow users to pass in any kind of view that they want, we need to make sure that we mark this with the @view builder, so SwiftUI knows that it's possible to have different types of views within return to you within this closure. Now when you actually scroll down in your preview, you should see that you have an error. And in order to fix this, you just simply want to use this curly brace and just type in empty and then underscore in. So in our SwiftUI preview, we're always just passing back an empty view and we're not actually using the async image phase that we're getting. We're going to look at this in the next bit of the video. Cool. So now what we want to do is we actually want to update our states and have our different views that we want to return back to our views that use this cache image. So in our loading, we just want to call our closure content. And then within the async image phase for this, we want to call empty. So now what's going to happen is that any view that is used within the closure empty case, it will get spat out in here. If we added a progress view into our empty case, you'll see that in here. If you added a text and so on and so forth. And then we want to repeat this for each one. So in our success, this time rather than it being empty, we actually want to pass through success. And you'll see that when you're working with this, when you're working with success, you need to actually pass through an image. So in order to resolve this, what we're going to do is we're actually going to unwrap our view and actually create an image and actually pass this through our success. Let's do that now. So what we're saying here is we're now going to create a UI image from our data, and then we're going to pass that image into an actual SwiftUI image view. So whenever we use this cache image closure and the content is success, we will now get this image passed through to us where we can apply our styles and it will be returned to us within this success case. Now you'll see here that we still need to actually handle this case path here, where we actually need to handle the error. So what I'm going to do is on our cache image, I'm actually going to create an error which allows us to throw back that there has been some invalid data. So let's do that now. Cool. So on cache image, I just created a cache image error where it will just throw back to us that there is invalid data. So let's actually use this now. And in order to use this here, we need to replace this with content dot content, and then we want to use dot failure, and then the error that we're going to pass in here is the cached image error dot invalid data. So now within our success case, we actually handle all the possible case paths in here. Now in our failed, we want to literally repeat this, but this time rather than us passing in this hard error here, we actually want to pass in error that is actually passed through our state. And then in our default, we then want to pass through the content empty like we do in our loading. Cool. So now in our cache image view, we have our loading, which will pass through for empty. Image success, if it's successful, then we'll pass through success. If it fails, we'll pass through failure. If it's failed the request, then we'll pass through failure. And then for default, we'll just pass in empty as well. So now in our food item view, we need to actually fix these errors because it's missing the parameter content. So let's actually set this up like you would set up an actual async image. So we just type out the curly braces here like so. If we just do phase in, we now should be able to access all the phases and return the images that we want. So I'm just going to do a switch statement on these phases like so. And now we can see that we have all of our phases like so. So in our success, let's just type in image like so. So let's actually just work through each case here. So for our empty, if it's empty, we just want to return a progress view. So I'm just going to type this out and I'll break it down. So for our empty phase, we're just going to always show a progress view, which is 100 by 100, has a blue background, which is clipped with around a rectangle. And then for our success, we want to show our actual image. So I'm just going to type this out again. So what we're saying for our success is that we're going to return an image, which is resizable. The content aspect ratio is fit, 100 by 100. It's got some padding and it's also got a blue background in it as well. So you can see here that by us having that closure, if I just get these up side by side, if I just go back into the cache image, by us having this closure here, we're actually able to get the async image phase in our view, as you can see, and we're able to return some kind of view here with this generic, so we can return any kind of view that will be used within our Z-stack. So now, let's close this. We now need to handle our failure, and for our failure, I'm just going to show an SF symbol with an X mark. So now that we've done that, we've also got one more case that we want to cover. So by default, SwiftUI will suggest that you may have unknown cases in the future. So just for this unknown, I'm just going to literally just put an empty view. So just return nothing like so. Okay, cool. So now we've got that working. Now we've got this error here. We're not actually using it, but just to show you, if you want to use this error, you can actually access it from here and just do whatever it is you need to do. And in order to actually see an error, I'm actually going to force the first one to be an invalid image. So in order to do that, what you want to do is in your view model, so menu view model, the first one, if we were just to set this to an empty string like so, we should see that it messes up. So let's just go back into our food image view, and then now let's actually just run this and see what happens. So you'll see that you could see our progress views then, and now it's loaded. And also you can see for our error, we've actually got this X mark here as well to show that there's something gone wrong. And if I keep scrolling, you'll see that it's all working. Now let's go to our network inspector tab and let's look at what's happening. So as you can see, as the applications are live and we scroll through more and more, there's actually no issues with it. And it's actually fetching our images from the cache. So this is all working great. But what I actually want to do is I actually want to build on top of this and add in the one final thing that you can do with async image, and that is added in animations and transitions. So when you're working with async image, you're able to pass in and specify what type of transaction you want to occur when the image leaves and enters the screen. So what we're going to do now is see how we can add in animations and transitions. So if you want to learn more about this, you can check out my video, Animations and Transitions in SwiftUI. So let's go into our cached image view. And within our cached image, below our URL, we're going to add in two new properties for our animation and our transition. Cool. So now we're using the animation and the any transition, but you'll notice that on animation, I've actually specified that this is optional. And the reason why is because I'm giving you the ability to decide whether you want this to even be animated at all. So if you use to pass in nil, then you won't actually see any animations. But if you set an animation, then you're going to see one. So right now, because of the way structs work in Swift, we now have to pass in a value for both of these because of the initializer. So what I actually want to do is I actually want to give you the ability to actually have a default value for each one of these two properties here. So let's actually generate a member-wise initializer for this. So in order to do that, what you want to do is just hold down Command on your keyboard and click on Cache Image. And if you click on Generate Member-wise Initializer, you'll now see that it generates an initializer for you. Let's just cut this, and then we're going to paste this below here. And then now we're going to separate this out. So now the first thing we want to do is on our initializer, we want to remove the internal because we don't actually really need that because it's there by default. And you should now see that in our initializer here, we're able to actually pass in default values such as nil. And for our transition, we're just going to say identity as its default. But we've now got a new error. And this new error is because we need to actually change where our view builder is positioned. So rather than our view builder being here, we now want to set our view builder on our initializer. So let's just move that. Cool. And the reason why we need to do that is because when we actually create an instance of this view, we want SwiftUI to know that when you use this closure, you can pass in any kind of view, so it's flexible. So now that we've got our two properties for animation and transitions, we actually need to use this in our views. So if you just go onto your Z stack above your task, we just want to use the animation modifier to animate changes that happen within our source of truth. So let's do that now. So it's really important that when you're working with animation, that you actually use the animation modifier like so. Because what we're saying here is that we only want to animate changes when our current state updates. Now, when you set the animation modifier, you're actually going to have an error. And the reason why is because our current state here doesn't actually conform to equatable. So let's actually go into our cached image manager. And we're just going to update our enum here to conform to equatable. Now that we've done that, we get another error, and the reason why we get this error is because these enum cases actually have associated values, so Swift actually isn't able to automatically figure out what the equatable status is for each one of these cases. In order to fix this, we actually need to conform to the equatable protocol and explicitly tell Swift which cases are the same. So in order to do that, to clean this up, let's just remove it from here, and I'm just going to do some typing out and then we'll break it down. So what we're saying here is we're adding an extension on our cache image manager's current state and we're using the equatable protocol, and we've now got a function generated for us where we compare the left and right hand side whenever two current states get compared. So if these two are the same, then we return true. On our failed, we're comparing the localized descriptions for our errors, and on our success, we're just comparing the data. So now we're able to use the equatable protocol on our current state with this method. Because of our associated values, we need to handle it ourselves. So now, let's just build this, and you should see that our errors goes away. But if we go back to our image, cache image, we're not done just yet. What we actually need to do now is we need to actually apply the transition that we want for each view to have. So on each content closure here that returns a view, we actually want to use the transition modifier and pass in our transition. So let's do that now. Cool. So what we're saying here is on each content that returns some kind of view, we're going to apply a transition and use the transition modifier on it. So now all of our views will get the transition effect. Okay, cool. So now let's go back into our food item view, and this time we're going to use our new parameters in our cached image. So after our URL, we're going to say animation, and we're going to give it a spring animation. And then for our transition, we're going to specify that we want it to scale and be combined with an opacity, like so. So now, if we just scroll through this, you'll see that nothing's changing when we scroll. But if I run this now, you'll see that we get that effect where it scales with an opacity. So we get this nice effect with our image. So we're basically mimicking now async image, which is great. So before we actually wrap up on this video, there's one more thing that I just want to show you, and I just want to go through it in our cache image manager. And the problem that we have here is that we're actually printing to the console that we're fetching an image and we're caching an image. Now, if you was to use this in your apps, yeah, this is actually going to be printed out in production, which you probably don't want to do because it's just unnecessary. So in order to fix that, we're going to wrap this in an if debug state. So it only executes this print statement when we're in a development environment. So let's do that now. So once you do that, you just want to use the hashtag symbol. So now, if we just run this, you'll see that our app works the exact same way. The only difference is now is because we're actually running this on Xcode, this will actually print it out to the console. But if we was to release this to like the App Store, these print statements will actually not appear within our final build. And just to show you how we can actually change the animations a bit, I'm actually just going to tweak this. So rather than this being a scale, just to show you that it actually, you can make this different, we're going to use a, let's say, a slide animation. And let's just see what this looks like. So we're going to use a slide animation combined with an opacity because that looked god awful. So yeah, there we go. So now we get this slide animation where they come in from the right and they kind of fade off the screen as well. So you can see now that we're actually able to get our transitions looking nice, which is pretty sweet. Cool. So the last thing we want to do is the honors of deleting our async image. And we're done with the video. So that's everything in this video. If you enjoyed it, I'd love to hear your feedback in the comment section below. Also as well, if you haven't already, I'd really appreciate if you gave this video a thumbs up, as well as subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell to get updates for whenever I release a new video. That's everything from me. I'll catch you on a bit. Deuces.